Hi everyone! Welcome back to another wonderful lesson in the world of AP history with me, Miss Warren. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about the Columbian Exchange because you can't talk about the maritime empires during this time without talking about what they did. So let's dive right into it. So you all have learned about the Columbian Exchange forever and a day. Well, we're going to take a deeper dive into it to look and see how much the Columbian Exchange changed. So all of you have been engaging in this Columbian Exchange project where you look at a food item and you do the research to see how it impacted the world, right? Just think about what you eat on a daily basis and just imagine that if the Columbian Exchange hadn't happened, we wouldn't have had that food. Pizza would not exist without the Columbian Exchange. Ooh. So, there was this time period right before we know is the Great Dying. This is like old world diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, all that good yummy stuff became present. There was this long isolation period from the Afro-Eurasian world, and the lack of most domesticated animals meant that there was an absence of immunities. So these diseases were very much present. So in the old world, which is the Eastern Hemisphere, these diseases mostly affected children, but survivors did gain immunity to these diseases after a while. In some parts of Europe, smallpox was responsible for about 10 to 15% of the deaths. People viewed smallpox as a death sentence if you got it, because you had no strength against it. So diseases were spread quite easily, as we know, once the Europeans started coming to the Americas. It ravaged the Mexica and the Aztecs starting in about 1519. It's estimated that the population in Mexico of the Aztecs went from about 17 million down to 1.3. And that's just in Mexico. That's not looking at the United States. It's not looking in South America. That's just one area. Diseases were able to reach more remote areas well before the explorers ever arrived. And this was because of indigenous traders or travelers. In some cases, up to 90% of the native population died from European and African diseases. And it wasn't until the late 17th century did the native numbers begin to recuperate from this catastrophe. In the United States, it would continue to get worse, but that's United States history. So the Great Dying actually created a massive labor shortage, as we all know. So this made room for the newest newcomers, both colonizing Europeans and enslaved Africans. Europeans, Africans, and combinations of indigenous people created entire new societies in the Americas, and these societies replaced many and varied cultures that had existed before Columbus ran aground in 1492. Because remember, the loss of a people means the loss of an entire culture. The way they had their society set up, their art, their history, their language, gone. So we know that the Columbian Exchange involved not only people, but plants and animals and other types of food. And this transformed the landscape and made a European diet more possible. So you had animals that became revolutionary, like horses and pigs and cattle, goats, sheep. This made ranching economies possible. This is what existed out in the Midwest and still in the Midwest in some areas today. So overall, because of this exchange, the world population increased. because you had a large food supply and there was a variety in that food supply, which meant that you had more of a caloric intake. You had livestock, which ultimately altered the landscape because you need land to be able to feed the cattle and pigs and horses and so on. And because the environment changed and there was more of a food supply, not only did the world population grow for humans, but it also grew for these animals, which utterly devastated the natural landscape. But on the flip side of this, you now had an easier source of meat and milk and hides and wool. Horses probably were the single most important thing that transformed the Americas in particular, because natives could now travel further and faster, they could hunt more efficiently, and they could actually wage in a different warfare. Horses were revolutionary to the landscape of the Americas. Now you had the American food crops come into play that were now being widely spread throughout all of the Eastern Hemisphere. This provided a nutritional foundation that was much more readily available and immense to help the world population grow. Now in Europe, calories were derived from corn and potatoes, and this helped push human numbers from about 60 million in 1400 to just 390 in 1900. That's incredible growth right there. It also provided a cheap and reasonably nutritious food source for millions of industrial workers. Ever heard of the potato famine in Ireland? Well, cool. We're going to talk about it if you haven't. So I'm going to play this little video of the potato famine.
The Irish potato famine, 1845 through 1852. 1845 in Ireland. The Irish potato famine, 1845 through 1852. In 1845, in Ireland, the potato crops were failing and potato plants were turning black and rotten. The cause was potato blight, or more specifically the fungus Phytophthora infestans, caused by the wind, rain, and insects. It spread throughout Europe, but hit Ireland the hardest. This would be known as the Great Famine, or the Great Hunger. By 1845, the potato, which was originally brought into Ireland by the landed gentry, was Ireland's most important crop. Almost half of Ireland's population, mainly the rural poor, were dependent on potatoes to live. The average Irishman ate 14 pounds of potatoes a day. They grew well in Ireland's climate, and even in poor soil and in wet and cold conditions. Potatoes were nutritious, a great source of vitamin C, and their harvest was plentiful, so there was enough to feed families, and farmers had enough surplus to feed their livestock. The Irish were overly reliant on one variety of potato called the Irish lumper. This lack of variation put Ireland at high risk of mass famine. When blight hit the potato plant, it may look edible from the outside, but it was a slimy pulp inside. It would soon appear rotten and shriveled once the fungal spores settled on the plant, which spread to healthy potato plants around it quickly through the breeze. The smell was so revolting that it could make a person vomit, and eating an infected potato would leave them in agony. One of the sources for the blight may have been the United States. Arriving through ships coming to Europe, a strain of blight was seen in 1843 on America's eastern seaboard, but going further back, the pathogen could be traced to Mexico. Great Britain had the richest empire in the world at this time, and had an oppressive rule over Ireland. For the first year of the famine, there was little death from hunger. British Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel imported corn or maize from the United States. However, there weren't enough mills to ground it, and the poor couldn't afford it. As well as this, the Irish peasants' diet of potatoes made the corn unsatisfactory. Unlike potatoes, it lacked vitamin C, so dependence on corn resulted in scurvy. While some Irish got used to the cornmeal, there was not enough to go around. Surprisingly, even as things got worse, grain and other foods were still being exported to Great Britain during the famine. Lord John Russell took power as Prime Minister in June 1846 and formed a Whig government. It took a laissez-faire approach, which meant minimal government involvement in the economics of Ireland. The British government looked down upon the Irish as less than human, and their potato crops as lazy, suggesting that they needed to unlearn dependency on the government. The Protestant evangelical belief that the famine was an act of providence, a divine judgment, also justified inaction. Charles Trevelyan, a civil servant with direct responsibility for the government's handling of the famine, was a big supporter of this idea. The British government opened soup kitchens in 1847, which fed over 3 million starving Irish peasants, but they closed them down after 6 months. They also continued to export food that could have fed the starving Irish population, as they did not want to interfere in the business of the English landowners. Public work schemes were also introduced to provide employment, but malnourishment made hard labor extremely difficult for workers. Most of the Irish were Catholics, and half did not own the land they worked on. Instead, they were renting and working on tiny plots of land for English landowners, many who were absentee landlords who lived in Britain, not Ireland. Because of the famine, Irish peasants fell behind on their rents and were evicted. Their houses were often demolished to prevent them coming back. Many went to the overcrowded workhouses, where disease like typhoid was rampant. As well as death from starvation, famine-related diseases killed many of those suffering, a cause of a weakened immunity from malnutrition. Those that were evicted from the lands and had nothing to eat could be seen dying or dead in ditches along roads. Many committed crimes, stealing food or trying to get caught on purpose in an attempt to be sent to jail or a penal colony like Australia, where they might be fed. By the time the potato crops recovered in 1852, 1 to 2 million Irish left the homeland and emigrated, some to Britain and many to North America, where many died on the coffin ships during the journey from hunger and disease. The Irish refugees that reached the east coast of the United States established themselves in cities like Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The Great Famine was one of the worst times in Irish history and left 1 million dead. The Irish population had dramatically declined, with 1/4 dead or emigrated, spurring a century-long population decline.
Transformed an entire economy and also devastated it.
Subscribe for more history.
So the potato famine in Ireland was absolutely, utterly devastating. As I said, there's no other way to put it. The population, as we saw in the video, dramatically just fell to pieces. The population between 1841 and 1851, because it ended in 1852, in some places you had over 30% of the population just disappear. Now there are some places, obviously, where the population did rise, but for the most part, all of Ireland was just demolished. So, let's talk a little bit about how the Qing dynasty played a role in the Columbian exchange. Well, there was prosperity that was based upon agriculture, so this high yields of new methods from the new methods that they used to cultivate the land. So you had rice, wheat, and millet. Then you also add in the new foods from the Americas, like maize and sweet potatoes and peanuts, raised on soil, and they're not appropriate, for previous crops. So you had new foods that were able to sustain rapid increase in the population, which made it easier to feed a lot of people. Population outpaced food supply during this time, but it wouldn't become evident, really not seen, before 1750. So you had this population growth that was supported by trade and the influx of American silver in China. So these Chinese workers would produce silk and porcelain and tea in exchange for the American silver. This is also one of the reasons why, you have the Opium Wars and getting Chinese addicted, is because of that silver coming from the Americas. So this is how much the population increased between the different dynasties. So you have overall population here, and this is, the millions. So you have between 2 and 60 million here, starting, the year 100, let's say. And then you have all the way up here. That's a lot of people by the year 2000. Billion people living in China. Oh yeah. So the the Columbian exchange gave rise to something wholly new in the world, and that was this interacting in the Atlantic world that connected four different continents. Now, these two old worlds were joined and increasingly creating a single biological regime, a new world of global dimensions. So there was some imbalanced outcomes from the Columbian exchange. There were long-term benefits of this Atlantic network, but it was unequally distributed. Western Europeans were the dominant players and reaped all the rewards of it. As new information entered Europe, it contributed to a revolutionary new way of thinking. That was the scientific revolution. So the wealth of the colonies, those precious metals and natural resources, provided the foundation, the political and economic foundation for Europe's Industrial Revolution. The colonies also provided an outlet for rapidly growing populations in Europe's societies to come to the New World. And this changed the global balance of power and trust that the previously marginal Western Europeans, became central in commanding roles on the world stage. So we can't talk about the New World without talking about sugar. Sugar colonies were typically in the lowlands of Brazil, that was controlled by Portugal, and in other Spanish, British, French, and Dutch colonies in the Caribbean. There was a huge demand in Europe for sugar. It was used for medicinal purposes and for spice. It was used as a sweetener and also as a preservative. Really started to use it in everything. And sugar was almost exclusively an export. It was very rarely kept or imported in the colonies. For a century, Portuguese planters along the northeast coast of Brazil dominated the world market in sugar. Then the British, French, and Dutch turned their Caribbean territories into highly productive sugar-producing colonies, and this was breaking the Portuguese-Brazilian monopoly on the area. So, what are some of the effects on the Eastern Hemisphere? Well, you had an increased population throughout the Old World. These populations were divided into classes, and then they also increased trade, which gave way to specialization of labor. Then you saw an increased cultivation in farmland and private property, and increased use in rural areas. Which meant, so as Europeans' population were growing and people were moving to the Americas, those immigrants had access to a brand new world. But those who stayed behind, they again could change their station if they so could. Also, a lot of Europeans just started exporting their criminals, as seen in the video for the potato famine. All right, we're going to continue talking about the Columbian exchange in class. I will see all of you later. Bye.